When do you know you're going to be making a quilt? Do you see fabric that you can't pass up, or a pattern that you want to try, or is it a special occasion you need to make a quilt for? Me, it's the fabric. And when I saw this beautiful, gorgeous, brightly colored floral print, I couldn't pass it up. And I brought it home, and I'm opening and looking at it and loving it. And half of the fat quarters had a white background, so I knew I could do some low volume. I was really excited. And then I got to the last piece of fabric, and it was a panel. What am I going to do with a panel? I've never made a panel quilt before. I'm Leah Louise from Inspired Quilting by Leah Louise, and I'm here to challenge you to step outside your box. Get a little creative, try something different, and you'll be really surprised and excited with how much fun you can have with your quilting, doing something outside the box, something different that you've never done before. I love how this quilt turned out, and I want to show you a couple ideas that I really had a great time with. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm anxious to show you this. I really like this. This is by P&B Textiles, and I found the name. Here we go. I wasn't sure. The name wasn't on the ticket. It's called Full Bloom by Courtney Morgenstern. I love these fabrics, the colors. Look at that. Oh my goodness. And of course, you know I love florals, and when you get into these watercolor prints, they are so beautiful. Look at this. What are those chrysanthemums called, with the little spider chrysanthemums maybe? I don't know, but they are pretty. I love the color selection in these. Look at the beautiful colors. And that's what's fun, to get a primary print, a focal print that has lots of color, and then pull your solids in. If you notice, that's what they do. So they take the colors out of these prints and create near solids, but background fabric or background colors in fabrics that are going to coordinate, and that's how they put a collection together. Here's a quick peek at the quilt before we get started. There's basically two major components. First is dealing with the panels and getting them trimmed out, and then creating the background, which I did with low volume. And I love how it turned out. I do want to show you a close-up of the low volume fabric. Here's one of the blocks that I made that was part of the outside, I guess you call it a border, the area that goes around the center panel. And this is what I want to show you today, is how to make this kind of a low volume background. And I love doing it this way. It's so much fun. So let's go ahead and get started. I want to show you how this works. I have one of my corner blocks and the 1.5 inch strips I'm going to use to trim it. The first thing is to run these strips together so I can just sew continuously around the block. And I'm going to use a diagonal seam. I just like the way they look in a narrow border around a block. And rather than have a straight seam, because there are a lot of straight corner pieces in this particular quilt, the way it's laid out in the center, I don't want to emphasize that with even more. I'd rather these be on the diagonal so it doesn't look like it's pieced in the manner the others are. It's going to look more blended. And I don't know about y'all, but with a 1.5 inch piece and I cut this little corner off, I don't think there's much I can do with that. So that I'm going to go ahead and let go. And now then I just finger press. So I have this wonderful diagonal seam there. I finger press it down, and then I get my fabric, my corner or my square I'm going to work with, and I sew the first piece on the bottom. And so I'm just going to line it up in the corner and let it overhang just a little bit. There we go. And do my 1/4 inch. So these blocks cut at 11 inches. So I cut them out to include that little dot border and a bit of the yellow. I kind of hated to cut all that off and throw it away. So I decided to leave a bit on there. I'll only get about 1/4 of an inch of it, but I like that little extra color. It looks like a nice little pinstripe border that I added, but it's already there, so that makes it very easy. Now I'm going to make sure that this seam is finger pressed away towards the outside, and then I'm going to lay this on top. I want to get it nice and straight along this side, and then it's going to lay straight. Whoops, there's a thread there from the previous seam, and I'm just going to lay everything nice and neat and line it up and go. I like putting a narrow border like this. It separates the print from the other pieces. All right, so when I get down here, I want to make sure I finger press so that that's going in the direction I'm sewing. Oh, I didn't separate them. I couldn't figure out what was happening. It was stuck. Okay, here we go. We get down to this end, and I sew a couple stitches over. Rather, I don't want to stop right on the edge. And then I leave about 1/8 of an inch as I'm trimming, because I don't need a lot. Everything's going to be nice and square. And then I'll put this one on. Put it right here. And I get that little bit of thread that when I sewed, that piece kind of went along with me. And then I'm just going to sew down to the other end, and this will be finished. Line up the last side. Make sure this seam is nice and flat. And sometimes if the I want to say, whoops, excuse me, I bumped the camera. If this 90 degree isn't spot on, you can have this fabric kind of pull inward. Well, all you need to do is kind of replace it out to where it needs to be. It can also be caused by your stitches if they're particularly tight and they're pulling on the thread and they draw the thread away to make it, tighter. Make that seam more snug and tight. So, but there we go. So that looks nice and straight. And I'm just going to trim this little bit here. Now what I'm going to do is give everything a good pressing. So I'll kind of give a finger press, and I'll cut my seams or my thread as I go. Oh my goodness. Guess I didn't trim any of these, did I? And finger press all these to the outside so that I can go ahead and press them with the iron, and then there we go. So this little border just adds some nice interest. We've got the flowers here that I think are beautiful, and then by creating a border around each one, it just makes those colors pop. I think it's a lot of fun. So I've got all 4 of these finished. Now we need a border around the big block, and that's going to be done a bit differently. So let me show you that. Each of my squares were cut down out of the panel, and I left a little bit of the yellow trim on there. I hated to cut it all off just because I thought it would look so pretty, but I could only leave 1/4 of an inch, but that's okay. It just adds a nice little border. It adds a break in the color, and the yellow works really good with all these prints. So each block has its own color border around it. So here's Love Grows Here, and Always Find a Reason to Shine. I tried to pick colors that matched the print, and this obviously had a lot of pink in it. This one had red and orange, Grow Wild and Free, so I thought that looked pretty. And this had that beautiful purple blue, and I thought this color would look great. Live Life in Full Bloom. So these are going to be the 4 corners of the quilt. And then what I'm going to do is the center section. And this one measured about 18 inches across. And again, I left a bit of the edging on here to just kind of create a little blended, what do I want to say? A blended transition between the panel and the fabric. In this case, I used a yellow polka dot border all the way around, and then a row of charm squares, putting a charm square in the corner. So I did this extra piece here. And so each corner has its own, pretty little block, and it's all surrounded with the yellow, I don't know, lattice or sashing. What do we call it? Is there a particular? I think lattice is narrow, sashing is wider. I don't know if it even matters. But then what we're going to do is we are going to create a narrow border around here. I had hoped to use the yellow, but I only had one fat quarter and there wasn't enough to do the outer edge as well. So I'm going to piece all the fabrics into little 1-inch squares and put it around. Let me show you how that's going to look. I brought the fabric over to my machine and just started sewing and didn't even start recording. So I got a bit of a head start, but you can see what I'm doing. I'm going to create kind of like a postage stamp border. It's going to be a length of 1-inch squares. So I'm sewing everything at 1.5 inches. And the reason I'm doing them so small is everything I'm working with is a fat quarter. And I don't have enough of any one fabric to go all the way around. That large block measures 30 inches on each side. And I used this yellow on the inner border, and that used up the entire fat quarter. And I didn't want to go with mixing up other long lengths of these strips to create the border. So I thought it would be more fun to alternate it with the yellow and some of the bolder colors, because they'll stand out really nice as a border. And so I just go through and put all these together. And let me add this one. And with any luck, I should be able to get enough of my small squares here to equal what I need to get around the block. And by going with this smaller size, I can easily pull out some other fabrics to add to it. But these were left over from the 4 corners that I used, and so they were already cut. So I grabbed those. And now, let's see what else I can do. Of course, this is the extent of my yellow, these 4 pieces. So I will be quite frugal with how I use it in order to get through. I could have done the border, but I was like 6 inches short. Oh my goodness. It was just so close, and I couldn't find anything anywhere. I was searching on the floor going, surely maybe I just dropped a piece, but no such luck. So what I'm going to do now is press everything in one direction. It doesn't really matter which, as long as everything goes the same way. And then that's the way I'll be sewing it. And I intentionally just sort of mix things up so it's not really too directional. We've got some words here, but the block is going to go in every direction, so the trim pieces are not going to stand out that much. So what I need to figure out is if I have enough, I will cut these. I'll trim that edge off. Then I'm going to cut these into 1.5-inch strips. I'll see how many I have. I'm pretty sure I'm going to need to add another couple extra colors, but I can just use these pieces down here, cut them off, bring them up there. Oh my goodness, it's definitely patchwork at this point, more like piecework, trying to get all these little pieces together to make the border that I need. So let me go ahead and pull all those together, and I'll show you where I am and how much more I have to do. I do believe I have enough more strips here to get the total number that I need to get around the block. And so I'm just going to continue sewing strip after strip. These are all 1.5-inch strips, and they will be 1-inch finished. So it'll make a fun little checkerboard going around the edge of the big block. And then outside of that will be the low volume blocks that we're going to piece separately. So this is kind of a fun quilt in that we have some regular patchwork, we have some panels and some 1.5-inch lattice strips or sashing, and then we have some 5-inch charm squares, and then we'll get around the outer edges and we're going to piece some low volume sections to insert between all these bright colorful blocks. So I think it's going to really be a nice balance. All right, just a few more to go. Let me get these in and I'll get everything pressed. What I'm doing is I did press the first section. I'm going to just have everything go all in the same direction. And then as I cross cut these into 1.5-inch pieces or strips, I'm going to sew them all together. And it should work out great in that it will, whoops, get extra thread here, that it will then line up along the edge of the large block. So we're getting closer. With my chain piecing of all these 1-inch strips, actually they were 1.5-inch, and sewed them in strips, cross-cut them into 1.5-inch strips, and then sewed it all together into one long piece. And then what I'm going to do is I'll start with one end in one corner, and I will, sew it here, obviously right sides together, take it around, and it should line up right here. So what I'll do when I get to the end is I'm just going to cut or take those threads out. It was just easier to sew the whole thing in one piece, and then that way I don't have to worry about going around the corners, because remember, if this is 30 inches, then the next one is going to be 32 inches, then 32, and then 34. So rather than cut all that, and it's just easier to make a mistake if I pre-cut it, I'll sew it and I'll trim it up as I go, and then the border will be ready. Now, once this is all done, we'll have this in the center, one of the pretty floral blocks in each corner, and then in between these sections where these blocks will come here and here, obviously it'll be much wider, but this whole section up here is going to be covered, going to be filled in with low volume fabrics, and that's going to be so pretty. I'm going to piece that together and I'll show you how that's going to work. So this is coming along great. I'm loving all these colors. Sometimes it can be daunting if you have a pile of fabric in assorted sizes and colors and mix, and it can be a challenge to figure out how you're going to put all this together. I want to show you how I piece my sort of scrappy low volume blocks. And what I do is I keep everything 5 inches and larger in their separate bins, because those I will use by size. And if you've seen how I cut my fat quarters, I always cut, strips in the 3 varying sizes that I use, 10, 5, and then what's left. This is what's left. I use these pieces. I keep them in strips like this until I'm ready to use them. And, they're various width depending on the size of the fat quarter. But then I also have blocks like this in different sizes. And I had a couple other here. Anything smaller than a charm square, I keep in here as well. And then I have some small strips, rectangles that are sort of not a block and not a full strip, but there's something that can be done with that. And I happen to have a bunch of those. But then I have a lot of the lengths that I cut off my fat quarters. So these work really well for combining blocks together. And so what I'll do is I kind of separate into strips, pieces that are long and on the wider side, but then I'll keep these little tiny ones as well. And this I can use. I'm going to show you how I do that. And then these are some lengths that I've used part of, and so I save these extra lengths on the side. Now, I know I've seen other quilters who are incredibly diligent about how they, how do I want to say it, how they save these pieces, how they hold, how they stage them, how they, put them away for the next time. And what I do is I'll go through and I'm going to do what I'm going to do, and then I'll kind of put all my strips together and the blocks together, and I'll just lay them neatly in a bundle, in one of my bins. And that works out really well because then when I need them, I have all my pieces together. I am not going to cut all these into squares because I like mixing it up. I like mixing squares and rectangles together in order to have a more, I guess, abstract patchwork. I don't want everything, in concise square pieces throughout the whole quilt. And I like it to be changed up. I like it to be mixed up because it adds a lot of interest. If I have a fabric that maybe has a lot of color, I may not want to use this in a large form, but maybe I will take, a piece that's wider and maybe trim this down and put it there, and it looks great. And then I can put something on the other side. So it does two things. It's adding color to what might otherwise be kind of a bland print, which quite honestly could be used to describe a lot of low volume fabrics. We're very polite in how we describe them, in saying that they're neutral and they're subtle and they're low color value. And all that means is that they're kind of on the bland side. And while I love them together, and they're a beautiful background, and even a quilt filled with all low volume is, I think, beautiful. And I have an affinity towards color, so I have to put color in mine, at least to some degree. And so I want to show you how I mix all this up. So let me get some samples of what I've put together already from all this fabric that I had laying here and show you how to proceed. The first thing I start doing is combining pieces by size. I'll find little strips like this and kind of put them together, and then I find blocks of various sizes. I went ahead and sewed some up, so I may not have a lot of loose ones right here. But what I'll do is I'll put them together by their width, and I'm going to size them accordingly. So I'll have some that are this size. You see, that's a bit, actually there's a smaller end. These could go together, and I may come back and put them together, but initially I'm just going to pair pieces, put 2 or 3 together and see how it works. Now this is wider, so it's not going to be connected to do that, but I will hang on to this because as I get more pieces connected and maybe trim up other sections, I'll get some that are similar in width. And then what I do with all these is I'll create strips like this. Now these happen to be a number of different blocks that I had left over from another low volume quilt. So they're all the same size. I'm going to connect them, and I go through and I do everything in pairs. Then I come back and I put all the pairs together. Now, because this is what I would say a larger size block, it's probably about a 3.5 inch cut. Final finished size will be 3 inches. And I don't want my blocks to be much bigger than that in a low volume quilt, unless it's a large quilt and I'm going with a lot of larger pieces. But generally speaking, when I do a low volume, I keep them under 4 inches. So I'll do strips like this, and I'll get a bunch of them sewed together, and then I have these pieces. Now, a lot of times I will get this kind of a strip where I've trimmed off a block and I have this extra section right here. And so I'll set that aside, and they look kind of small. And how are you going to use them? If I stack them like this, let me get this out of the way so you can see better. If I stack them like this, then that center seam lines up, and I don't want to do that. So instead, what I'm going to do is connect them end to end. So I can sew this together, And I'll tell you right now, I'd like these colors better. This is more brown. This is more greenish blue, and I think that matches better. And, you know, go this way or that. But irregardless of that, these are the things I think about while I'm doing this. Even when I'm talking, I have my mind going in, you know, other color directions. So when I sew these strips together, then maybe what I'll do is sew that along the edge here. So now all of a sudden I have a block that's looking a bit more interesting. Now I don't want to be matching seams, so I'm going to make sure that this will come down like this so that I'm not matching up any seams. This is supposed to be a easy, quick project, and I'm going to spend a lot of time putting blocks together. I don't want to then have to match a gazillion seams after the fact. Besides, when you have your offset seams like this, different sizes next to each other, it's more of an abstract look, and then you end up getting a piece that is something fun to look at in its entirety as opposed to looking at small pieces. I don't want to have one long strip of these blocks go across the entire quilt and then have, you know, a long strip here unless I'm doing a jelly roll quilt. So I'm not saying any of this is wrong. I'm just saying think about what the end result is that you want. And then that's how you're going to determine how your pieces will go together. Then start moving up into the larger sizes. So I'll get, you know, rectangles and blocks in various sizes like this. And again, they're the same width, so I'm going to sew them together. Now, because so many of these are batiks and in color, I'm not going to put all the colors together in one long strip, because in my low volume, I want this color in there, but I want it sporadic, spread out, not all in one little bundle where there's a bunch of color over here on this part of the quilt, but this over here doesn't. And so I will come through and just start pairing up pieces. So I had some wide rectangles that were the same width, and I just, you know, add these on here. This is the end that'll get trimmed off. I'm going to line up one side, let the other hang off, and that comes back and gets trimmed. So I put pieces together that I think I will like, and these all just happen to be on the narrower side. And then what I would do is come in and add another piece. Now, nothing says I can't do something like, let's see, you know, bring in something like this. Or let's say I had, you know, 3 narrow pieces like this that I could sew together and sew on the end. So this is where you can start mixing. But getting these base blocks set is what's definitely going to get your pieces organized into a larger section that you can then continue to build on. Here's a piece where I had a long strip of the squares like this, but then see how this is narrow, and these are the full-size squares. So I mixed them up with narrow pieces, and these were kind of shorter lengths, so I sewed them together into one long piece. And then what I'll do is take those strips that I sewed end to end like this, sew them along, and here we are. So this creates a really nice look. And you've got a lot of interest here. You've got a lot of pieces. And if you decide to do your low volume in strips, and let's say you have narrow, wide, whatever color, this would be a good way to do it. Alternatively, what you can do is come in and cross cut it. And like here's a good point where I could cut it and still have enough seam allowance. So that's one thing you want to consider, because you want to have enough fabric that you still can you know, use your seam allowance with not getting too small a piece. But this works out really well. I enjoy doing this. Here's another one. Let me show you a couple others that I have here. So these are the wide blocks that I sewed together in a long strip. And then what I did is take a narrow group and place that here. Now this actually is one of these that I cut in two. Remember I told you that I will take these wider pieces and cut them in half, one narrow and one wide? Well, that's what I do here. And so now I have two strips. So I have this one and this one. But see how different they look mixed with other fabrics. Now I'll come and do the same here. So these measure roughly they're less than 5 inches. So they're generally greater than 4, less than 5. And I'll cut them at like about 2.5 inches. And you can see how this is definitely narrower. This is the wider piece. So what I would probably do here is cut this on the narrow side, and then I have this large piece, and I can bring in, you know, something that I like, or if I want to go with color, whatever the case may be. And then you're creating some really great interest in your quilt. Now, here are a couple other pieces that I did. And let's say this is too long. You've got a nice wide piece. You could easily cut this right across here, or maybe you needed to trim up the bottom. So keep in mind, there's a lot of flexibility with how you can use all these different strips. And here's another fun one. So I took one piece here and I put another here. Now I'm going to come in and I'll cut this, and I will probably cut it on the narrower side here because I want these larger blocks to offset that print. It's a pretty busy print, and if I cut a narrow strip, that's going to be more dominant than this narrow piece. So by making it wider, this will sort of overshadow this piece and not let that be quite so dominant. Now along the way, you're going to get some big pieces, and go ahead and just do something like this. I like the text. I like the dots. They go well. They're gray and gray. And what I'll probably do is cut a narrow strip this way, put a long piece, cut it that way. There's just so many different things you can do. What I'm trying to just give you ideas about is taking all these little pieces, building them into something bigger. I know there are those that call crumb quilting, but I don't think this is quite that. I've just always called it my stash quilting method. And I have a quilt that I did out of leftover batiks, and it's a large lap quilt, and it's probably still my favorite quilt. I love how it turned out, and I need to do a video about that. I think you all would enjoy it. But we're going to work with low volume first. We're going to get these pieces put together, and then I'm going to make the sections that'll go around the panel quilt that I'm making. So this is where we are. It's time to start putting it all together. After lots of sewing and cutting and more sewing, I have lots of pieces here, and I want to show you how all this goes together. You may not be up for the time that it takes to do all this, but I really enjoy it. It's a bit like a puzzle putting it all together. So as I showed you, my first steps involved a lot of long strips. And then I put those strips together and generally end up cutting them. So these are just some pieces that are, you know, a couple strips of varying widths put together, and add some color and a little bit of interest. There's some text. And then I will start, you know, putting a few more together. Most of these are just, you know, a few blocks, and they're all sort of monochromatic. There's nothing flashy or bright in these. These are just my filler pieces. Then I get the focal pieces that I want to include. If I'm making strictly low volume, this is where I'll go. If I want to add color to it, then I'm going to do the same thing as I did here, but just add a little more color to what I'm adding to my bright block. So these are the fabrics from the quilt, from the panels, and I want to incorporate that in this outer border that I'm making. So I cut them in multiple different sizes, from small to large. The largest is 4 inches, and I just add them, you know, I'll take one long strip like this, and I'll just sew my blocks along as I go, and I'll put them through, and then I'll come back and trim them. So if you find that half square triangles are fussy, this might drive you crazy, because there's a lot of trimming, and not unlike when you do a log cabin, you want to make sure your edges are nice and clean. And you can certainly get around that, like this where I have one. I did a piece, and so then I'd come back and I'll just trim that little edge off. It just makes it cleaner while you're sewing. The other thing in looking at this, I don't want to have hugely, what do I want to say, really attention-getting graphics, black and white, in this particular quilt. So I have this print in here, but I've kept it on a small scale in most of the places where I've used it. I like it, and it will be, look nice in the quilt, but sometimes if you get too heavy on something like that, it becomes very dominant because black and white can be such a stark contrast. So, I'll get this single, then I'll come back. If I, have some pieces, I'll trim these off, and then I'll, line them up along and sew them this way over there. And just get some different pieces like this. That actually kind of goes in the filler pile. But then I come here and realize this needs to be trimmed. And so when I'm trimming these, I want to line my ruler line across a seam, and then I'll cut sideways. I do that generally instead of using the grid because it's very easy to line up your block kind of at an angle. Things can get wonky when you sew a lot of strips together, and they can sort of, if the strip isn't exactly straight when you're using it, you're using scraps, maybe it's perfect, maybe it's not, and you just want to keep the edges straight and square. So I'll come back and go through and trim these up, and that one's good. So this is sort of more of a filler. And so when I put these in, I just want to balance it with some other pieces that will sort of frame it. And so these are just extra kind of filler pieces, as are these. With a good pile of my filler pieces and my focal pieces, I start putting these two groups together. And what I get from there is something that looks like this. Sometimes they'll have the focal in it. Sometimes I'll put two of the fillers together. It just sort of depends how everything works. And so I just, make sure that I have blocks going in every which way. And then I'm going to come back and add more to it until they get bigger. And you can see this one's starting to get to the finished size. My goal is to reach 13 inches. Once I hit 13 inches, it doesn't matter what the other direction is, but my piece between the panels on the quilt is 13 inches by 32. So if I make a bunch of these and then I put them together, I'm good to go. So let me show you what I have. So these measure 13 inches from the top to the bottom. Put that out of the way here. And you can see how it's starting to come together. So on this one, here's one block right here. And I'm going to turn it this way. I think it's easier to see. So here's a seam for this block, and then here. So this has three sections that are pulled together. And this is where these long pieces come in. If I have let's get one of these small blocks here, and I want to make it a bit bigger, I'll just come in and add something like this. I can turn it this way, and then I can add another block like this on the other side. So it's all just about joining everything together. And so here's one. So I have 13 inches, and it's going to vary this way, obviously, depending on the size blocks that I use. And here's another one. This is 13, and kind of hard to see with the other one behind it. And so I just put as much together as I can. You can see that I have this seam right here. This was a strip that I added onto this to get my 13 inches. And then I have these two strips together. And this one, actually, there's 4 pieces, but I made sure those seams didn't match. And that's not a big deal. It just makes it easier. And I don't want it to look blockish, like everything was made in individual blocks. I just want it to be one continuous swath of low volume pieces. And so you can see here's one edge, and this is the other seam between these two, and then they were joined together. So that's essentially the steps, and it does take a bit of time, and they're wonderful. I love it. It's just such a fun finished look, and I like having some of the big blocks in here with the small ones. I think it creates a good balance, and some darker mixed with the lights. So decide what your values are going to be, your darkest and your lightest. For example, here's a bunch of my strips. So I get some of the beiges, I get some of the what do I want to say, the dark grays. I get a little bit of color, not a whole lot, but just enough to keep it interesting. And that's kind of my spectrum that I'm going to go with. And once I have that down, I just start pulling colors together, and that's it. So let me go ahead and show you just how I sew some of these. There's nothing particular about it. It's more about the cutting and the piecing and putting the pieces together. What I'll show you, though, is how in the beginning I do some of the joining of these long strips. That might be helpful for you to see, because sometimes that can get a little overwhelming. Where do I start? So let me show you that, and we'll put some blocks together, and we're getting really close. We're going to have a quilt soon. When I'm ready to begin sewing, I stage my fabrics, my blocks that I'm going to add more rows to, by size. So I have the bigger ones that have 2 or more strips on them, and they're, varying sizes depending on just what I happen to have. Then the next one are the larger blocks of the focal fabric that just have a single strip. And, some go horizontally, some go the long distance. So I just, sort of piece them together, and I'll come back and I'm going to add another row there. And then I also do the small. And whoops, this is one I didn't get trimmed off, but I'll go ahead and make sure I sew this side, and then I can trim that. But see how this looks like you have a bit of a triangle here? This piece was not square, and I knew that when I sewed, so I sewed it to the straight edge, and now I just have to go back and take care of that. These all have different low volume fabrics, and I want to do that so they don't all look the same. I don't always want to have the same, polka dot next to all of them, and then this and this. So I really go to a lot of effort to change things up a lot. And it probably seems excessive, and if you're just watching this and not doing it, I can appreciate how that feels. So the first thing I'm going to do is I have some strips that I'm going to use, and these are just some leftover, like this is leftover from a layer cake, and I am going to attach it here. And again, I'm going to sew on the straight edge, and then I'll come back and trim it. And let's see, I'm going to put it this way, so that I can put my seam on the underside. There we are. And I'm going to just sew along here. I leave a little bit of an overhang so I can trim it and make sure that everything's nice and straight. And I'm just going to do a quick sew right down here. Make sure I've got everything. Now, I don't use pins generally because most of these pieces are so small. When I get to a larger piece, then, chances are I may use a pin. So at this point, there's a couple options. I can sew it this way, I can sew it this way, and I'm going to take a look at what my next piece is and just decide. So I'm probably going to go this way because I want to use as much of this fabric as I can. I don't want to waste any more than necessary. And sew to the edge, keeping that 1/4 inch seam. And then I'll just sew off and go to the next one. So I found a pretty yellow that I thought would really look nice. Let me do it this way. And the reason I'm turning this is, see how this is nice and straight and this is a little bit jagged? I always want to go for the best side. And because a lot of these came from the scrap pile, you know, they've probably been rummaged through a time or two. Okay, then the other thing is I can put this piece right here. I'm going to get that, make sure I've got enough, and I think we can do this. Okay, so let me go ahead and sew this one. Now generally I want to leave at least 1/8, if not up to 1/4 of an inch between them. But these are small, so I don't have to worry about, you know, that much spacing. So you see how that works. Actually, let me just set these little ones aside and we'll go to some bigger ones. We'll get a longer piece of fabric I can use. Here, this will work. And let's see, so this one will look good this way. I'm going to turn it so that I can have the seam coming this way. It just makes it easier. So now I'm going to add this one right here. Get it lined up. Now, see, this one is overhanging just a little bit. It didn't get trimmed, but I know if I leave that little bit, I'm going to have a nice straight edge. And let's see. What else? I'm trying to think how I want to do this. Let's do, I like the, my apologies, the mic tipped over and turned off the video and I didn't realize that it had stopped. So let me show you where I was. We're adding pieces to this strip here, and we did this one the long way. And what I wanted to show you is if you get to the end and you have a little section, start your next strip on top of that section. And then now you'll have a little extra piece to tuck in along the way somewhere. My goal when I'm working with low volume fabrics is just to keep making the piece bigger and bigger, because ultimately that's what you want. So now I've had this batik on and I'm going to add some more strips. Because this is batik, you know, there's no right or wrong, so it's pretty easy to do. So I added this piece and then I got a little bit bigger. I wanted to add that. And then I got down here and you can see where I overlapped it. And then I added one of my little pieces here. I was excited about this because look at those beautiful colors. Oh my gosh, they work perfectly. And then I'm going to go ahead and add this piece. What I want to show you here is that this little narrow strip, it measures just shy, but it's about 7/8 of an inch. Down here it's closer to 3/4. But what I do here, I mean, I can sew this with my 1/4 inch and it's going to be narrow and that's fine. But there's kind of a way to save yourself here and use the seam allowance to your advantage. So when you put your fabrics together and you put the edges, you line them up because you're going to sew, right there, you're going to sew your 1/4 inch seam. Instead of putting this exactly together, offset it by, you know, just the smidgenest bit. See that? Just so you can see the fabric. It's not a lot. It's that couple threads that will give you just a little bit more. Now, that may be fussier than you want to go, and I don't do that often, but the advantage here, the reason I don't worry about being a very scant, narrow seam is these are all going to be pressed over. And when you have these pressed like this, that's reinforcing that seam. There's going to be tension, you know, in the length direction, but not so much in the width because these seams are holding everything nicely in place. So that's just another tip. If you find maybe you cut one of your blocks on any quilt that you're piecing and it's just a little bit shy and you need that bit, then add yourself just that tiniest little smidge there. It doesn't take much to help make a difference. And then when you press it, you're going to be, you know, doing pretty darn well. So let me get this set up. All right, I have everything in order here. Hopefully I won't get shut down again. And so you want to keep that distance consistent all the way through. And sometimes those seams want to pop up on you. All right, then let's add some of these. Let's get the long one in here. Let's see. I'll do this one, and then I can do that one. Yep, this will work. So I'm going to do it this way so I don't have to fuss with the direction of the seam allowance. And I'll tuck this right here. And add this last one. And we'll just line that end up. And now we have a group of blocks that are ready to be pressed. And I'm going to cut it on this side. Pressed and trimmed if need be, because like I said, I always leave, a 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch, so I have cutting room. I don't always cut as straight as I'd like, and sometimes it's very easy to have a little angle in your cut. And rather than deal with that, I just leave a little bit and then trim it nice and straight. And then these pieces I'll just save and use them where I can find a spot that I need to, fill in a small area. So nothing goes to waste. If, like me, you find midway through the process that you need a few more blocks and strips and squares, here's a quick way to do it if you don't have pre-made pieces already in your scrap pile. So I'll take a long length like this. This is a pretty little white with yellow polka dots. And then I'm going to take some wide widths. But instead of sewing it like this, I'm going to do it the long way. And then I can just come back and cross-cut these. And this way I don't get duplicates of, the same fabrics being together. Sorry, I bumped my camera again. My goodness. Okay, so we'll do this. And when I come back and cut these, they're going to be at different lengths. I don't put them all at the same block size. If it's easier for you, that's actually a good way to do it. I want to make sure this will fit, because then everything will line up and you'll have nice even blocks, and it'll be easy to finish off instead of adding and making lots of smaller pieces. I like that narrower, or what do I want to say, the tighter fit look, where there are lots of little pieces in there and big pieces and a jumble of everything. So let me go ahead, and I have some other strips here ready to go. So I'll take this one next. And I'm just going to continue in the same manner, make sure that's not a selvage. And just work my way through. Go to the other end. Oh, that's a selvage, okay. All right, so we have a batik. You can tell this one came right out of the pile. It's going to need a good pressing. Let's see. But the end is straight, so that's good. Let me just pull this thread out. All right. There we go. Let me see. Can I get one of these in? Look at that. Perfect fit. Okay. Go this way. And we even get that 1/8 inch space. That's perfect. let me show you what we do from here. What I'm going to do is cut these apart in between the strips. Get that one, line them up just like this. Okay, now what I'm going to do is pair them up. See, these are particularly light. This is a darker one, not by much. That's actually pretty light too. And let's see, so I can mix that in. I'm looking for some of the dark strips. I don't really have many dark, but what I can do is that would be a good match. And let's see, this would be a good match. Let's do these two. So what I'm going to do is take these over to the cutting board, my cutting mat, and I'm going to cut these roughly like that. But then what I'm going to do is cut another section where I can sew these two together. So let me show you. Well, actually, we can do it right here. We'll multitask. So I'm going to line these up so they're nice and even. Don't you just love when a good idea comes at just the opportune moment? So what I'm going to do is put these two pieces on top of each other. I don't need to worry about lining up the seam. I just want to make sure these are straight. And what I'm going to do is sew these so that I can cut them, and then I have my two pieces. So I want to come down probably a good 3 inches, which is right about here. And I'm going to sew that right there, making sure these are nice and straight. Now what I do, because I didn't draw a line, is I'm going to just gauge that this edge of the fabric is in line with my sewing machine table, like right here. So I just kind of make sure that's straight, and that works pretty well for me. So let me do another one and show you how this is going to work. So again, if you have a smaller piece, put it on top so you can see where it is. And if that one was 3, I'm going to probably do this at about a 2-ish right there. All right, so what I've done is I've created the next step for my next block. So if I had my rotary cutter right here, I would do this with that, but I'm going to use my scissors. So I'm going to cut this here, and now these 2 blocks are finished. Whoops, I didn't even show you that, did I? I'm going to cut this right here. And these 2 blocks now are separate. I have a nice double block, and this is sewn together. So now I'm going to just use my rotary cutter and cut that. I have my, let's see, I don't like using a pen, but it's all I have right here. So let me cut this at about, yeah, we can go 2 inches like that. I'm just going to put a line so I can sew that. I don't trust myself at this point to do a straight line right there. So that will kind of give me, I'm going to sew on that line. No, actually I'm going to sew to this side, so that'll be my cutting line. Wait a minute, what am I doing? That's my cutting line. Oh my goodness. I was going to sew it again, and I hadn't even cut it yet. Okay, so now I have these 2 blocks, which looks great. And again, I'm going to cut this right on the line that I drew. And so I have a double block that just needs to be trimmed. And then what I can do is put these together and line them up on one side so they're nice and straight. And I'm going to come down about, say, 3 inches. Where's my pen? And cut that there. And now I will sew 2 together. Along the other side, so it'll kind of be on the shorter side. I just want to see where it's going to match up the best. This right there looks good. So if you're working with a bunch of strips, a long variety of strips, this is a great way to do it. So the first thing you do is you run your narrow strip across the top, and then you cut these off. But before you cut them, you sew a seam across, and then that makes these 2 blocks like this. And then you can come back in and sew them in the other direction so you get them in this size. So think about, as you're sewing, as you're cutting, what's going to expedite the process for you and how much you can get done in one sitting. It'll make a big difference. So as you start piecing your blocks, you just want to keep adding to it. And I see that these together will pretty much fit right there. I've got my seam allowance, but see, I don't want those seams to line up. So I think what I'll do is I'll move that down here, and I'm going to switch this around, because if I put this here, oh, that's going to put that there. Let's go this way. Okay, here we go. This is the way we want it. So if I sew these 2 together right here, then I'm going to attach that right there, and it should line up pretty well. And the reason I don't want to deal with the seam allowances being in the same spot is because when it comes to pressing and, whoops, popping my bobbin out of there. When it comes to pressing and trimming, it can be too bulky in those areas. What's going on here? So take these 2 sections. I'm going to put them right sides together and do my 1/4 inch seam. And this should fit pretty nicely along the edge. And just like that. I love it. So these seams are going this way. I want these seams. They're mostly already pressed that way. I'm just going to finger press the one I just did. And so all my seams will be going in the same direction as I sew it. And that just makes it nice and easy. Okay. There we go. And we'll just line this up. We're going to sew that through. You know, there's a part of this that makes me think of crazy quilting. Now, crazy quilting is different in that it uses a lot of triangle pieces and a lot of overlapping, and it was done during the Victorian days because only the wealthy women could afford those fabrics. And then they would stitch them together to make a large piece, and then they would hand embroider on top, and some of those were just absolutely beautiful. And it's kind of a fun idea. There we go. Look, now I just made this one bigger. Now I'll find something to put in here. So you sort of think about it as sort of a crazy kind of wonky log cabin, maybe. I'm not sure what to call it. It's a bit of everything combined. Here, I have another one here. And this is getting a long one. And I want to, let's see. Yeah, this is just about the right size. I want to go ahead and add to this side, and then I'll put something kind of across this edge here. So let's see. These seams go every which way here. So I'm going to, those go that way. All right. I think I'll sew from this side. And because there's a good piece of gray in here already, I'm going to put this bluish gray green down here. I don't want those too close together. And if you find you have a lot of one color or one group of colors, just space them out. It's about balance. As long as everything doesn't fall in one, particular spot in your quilt, having it balanced throughout the quilt top is just, going to make it more visually appealing, and it's going to have a design look that you actually had a plan when you went into it. Now you can tell, other than knowing the fabrics that I'm using, I did not have a specific plan and had no idea what these blocks were going to look like. But that's part of the fun of it, the surprise of, what you end up with at the end. And you start piecing them all together, and it's pretty cool. I like it. So here we are. Now we have this block is a bit bigger. Here's another look at the finished quilt. I absolutely love how it turned out. The little border inside here with the charm squares and the lattice, I think, is a lot of fun. But the low volume, oh my goodness, it just really is a great background. It accentuates these bright colors. I like that there's a lot of those colors mixed in as well in the background, and plus there's a lot of other batiks and just lots of fun fabrics. This was a challenge to make. This was a lot of work because there were so many small pieces and getting it all together, but oh, so worth the effort. I really love how this turned out. I'm so glad you're here with me today. Thank you for watching, and I hope you're ready to get your own low volume quilt started. I think you just might like it. Have a wonderful day. As always, it's a pleasure having you here with me. Thanks so much.